So picture a small, incredibly fragile piece of history.
Right.
You're looking at a thin iron plate, and on it, well, there's a direct positive tintype image of a man.
Yeah, and it's a bit murky.
It is. It's a bit rookie. Kind of haunting, honestly. He's wearing an ascot tie, uh, a hair pipe breastplate, and this single long feather.
Which brings us to, I mean, one of the most hotly debated questions in American frontier history.
Exactly. Is it possible that we are looking at the only surviving photograph of the legendary Oglala Lakota leader, Crazy Horse?
It's an image that has caused, historians, families, researchers to just draw battle lines for decades.
Because the stakes are monumental.
Totally. We aren't just debating, old photography techniques here. We're debating the visual legacy of a man who actively, fiercely resisted the reservation system and everything that came with it.
Well, welcome to this Doc Dive. Today we are exploring the Crazy Horse Chronicles, where we enter the world of Crazy Horse and the Lakota through the people, the places, the objects, and, those surviving stories that bring that history to life.
Yeah, we take your stack of historical sources, the diaries, the eyewitness accounts, the forensic photo analyses, and really just try to find the truth in all that noise.
Right. And our mission for this deep dive is to unpack the absolute mountain of conflicting evidence regarding this disputed photograph, which is known as the Garnier tintype.
Yes.
And actually, I have a major personal admission to make right out of the gate.
Oh.
Yeah.
Usually you have your mind made up before we even sit down at the mics.
I really did. I mean,
Yeah.
I used to completely dismiss this photograph as a fake.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
I looked at the historical objections, the clothing, the studio backdrop, and I just thought, case closed, it's obviously not him.
Right.
But after really digging into the historical sources, the family traditions, and just the sheer chaos of 1877 for this deep dive, I've entirely shifted my stance.
Wow.
Yeah, I actually now believe it is more likely authentic than not. Though, I will fully acknowledge the 100% undisputed proof remains lost history.
That is a massive shift. But I think it highlights why we can't treat the authenticity of this image as settled fact either way.
Exactly.
We have to weigh documented paper trails against eyewitness recollections and family traditions against expert interpretations. It's a historical puzzle where half the pieces are missing.
And the other half might belong to a totally different box.
Yeah, exactly.
And that is where you come in. We are inviting you, our listener, to act as the third chair in this investigation.
Yep, pull up a chair.
I don't want you to just blindly accept my new conclusion. I want you to subscribe, examine the evidence alongside us, and weigh in. We'll throw some specific prompts your way as we go, and we want you to leave your final judgment in the comments.
So let's start with the baseline question. Why is the mere existence of a Crazy Horse photograph so extraordinary in the first place?
Well, to understand that, you really have to look at the incredibly narrow, just chaotic window of time he actually spent in what we'll call the white man's world.
Right, because Crazy Horse was a mystic. He was a leader of the northern Oglala who stayed out on the plains longer than almost anyone else.
He held out.
He did. He didn't surrender to U.S. troops at Camp Robinson, which was part of the Red Cloud Agency in northwestern Nebraska, until May 6th, 1877.
And his time there was brutally short.
Yeah.
Just 4 months later, on September 5th, 1877, he was fatally bayoneted by a military guard during a really chaotic struggle while he was resisting imprisonment at that very same camp.
So if a photograph was taken, it absolutely had to be during those tense, unpredictable 4 months in the summer of 1877.
The timeline is incredibly tight, but, the behavioral hurdle is even higher.
Much higher.
Yeah.
We have extensive corroborated documentation regarding his absolute aversion to photography.
Right, like Dr. Valentine McGillicuddy.
Exactly. He was the post surgeon who actually attended to Crazy Horse's sick wife, and he was present when the chief died. He noted that Crazy Horse positively refused to pose.
Yeah. When pressed, he reportedly asked McGillicuddy, "Why should you wish to shorten my life by taking from me my shadow?"
That concept of the shadow catcher is so crucial here.
It really is.
Native American beliefs at the time often viewed the camera with deep existential suspicion. William Garnett, who was a mixed-blood interpreter at the agency, described Crazy Horse as this incredibly modest man who would never consent to it.
They feared the machine captured a piece of their spiritual power.
And spiritual power was everything to him. His power, his woe-towley, or battle charm, was intrinsically linked to a vision he experienced as a youth.
Right.
In that vision, a warrior told him to dress modestly, wear no face paint, and keep a small brown stone behind his ear. Following those strict rules is what he believed kept him invincible in battle.
So stepping in front of a camera and having his shadow captured would arguably be a massive violation of the spiritual armor that had kept him alive.
Right. You don't just mess with that.
I hear that, and it's a really powerful argument. But I do have to push back on the idea of absolute unbending certainty.
Okay, how so?
Well, we know he hated the idea of cameras. But human beings are endlessly complex, They contain contradictions.
True.
Which brings me to you, third chair. How much weight would you give the claim that Crazy Horse never allowed a photograph? Does a pattern of refusal prove that he never made a single exception?
It's a tough call.
Because my thought is, if someone he considered chosen family or a deeply trusted ally asked him, maybe as a final favor in a world that was just rapidly ending, he might have relented, just for a moment.
I mean, that assumes he viewed a photograph as a harmless favor rather than a literal threat to his soul.
Yeah.
You're talking about a man whose entire survival strategy relied on rigorous spiritual discipline. You don't just, take a cheat day on your spiritual armor because a friend asks nicely.
Fair point. But let's say trust did override fear, just once. We have to talk about what making that exception in 1877 actually meant, because it wasn't a matter of him just saying okay and standing still for 2 seconds.
No, not at all. We have to look at the technology.
This is where the physical reality of 19th century photography comes in.
Right, because the photography of the post-Civil War era bears absolutely no resemblance to, snapping a digital selfie today.
None.
Photographers in the 1870s used the wet plate collodion process.
Which is wild. William Garnett, the interpreter we mentioned earlier, he suggested that if a photo was taken, someone must have sneaked up and taken it without his consent.
Right.
But when you look at how a tintype was actually made, the idea of sneaking a photo is honestly hilarious.
It is physically impossible. You couldn't just point and click. They relied on heavy, cumbersome wooden bellows cameras.
Yeah.
Often they used a 4-lens Bonton camera to make multiple images on a single metal plate. And Mark Osterman, who's an expert in historic photographic processes, has pointed out that while the equipment used to make the specific tintype was standard in the 1870s, it required a massive setup.
You needed an entire portable darkroom right there on site.
Exactly.
Let me try to put this into perspective. It sounds like trying to mix fast-drying wet cement, spread it perfectly flat on a mirror, and capture a photo before it dries.
Pretty much.
All while working inside a pitch-black, sweltering tent in the middle of a dusty frontier camp.
Yeah, a highly flammable wet cement, too. To make a tintype, the photographer coated a thin iron plate in collodion, which is essentially nitrocellulose dissolved in ether and alcohol.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And while that syrupy surface was still perfectly wet, it had to be plunged into a bath of silver nitrate in total darkness to make it light sensitive.
And it's dripping wet this whole time, right?
Dripping wet. It goes into a light-proof holder, gets shoved into the back of the camera, and then it's exposed by physically removing the lens cap.
So the subject has to sit perfectly still for the exposure, which could be several seconds long.
Right. And finally, before the plate dries, the photographer has to sprint back to the darkroom tent and immediately develop it with ferrous sulfate and acetic acid.
So the idea of a photographer hiding in the prairie grass and sneaking a wet plate photograph of a highly alert, battle-hardened warrior is completely absurd.
Completely.
It required the subject's full, patient, and probably highly annoyed cooperation. Crazy Horse would have had to sit there, staring down the barrel of this massive wooden box while a man manipulated volatile chemical.
Which forces us to look at the visual evidence of the man who supposedly did sit in that chair.
Right.
If he cooperated for this arduous process, does the man in the Garnier tintype actually look like the Crazy Horse described by the people who knew him best?
And this is where the historical record gets fascinating. Because Crazy Horse didn't look anything like the stereotypical Hollywood Native American warrior that pop culture has conditioned us to expect.
Not at all. We have very detailed accounts from Lakota contemporaries who grew up with him and fought beside him.
Guys like his spiritual mentor, Hornchips.
Yes, and his close friend, He-Dog, Short Bull, White Bull. We also have descriptions from military scouts like Frank Grenard. And they all paint a remarkably consistent, highly specific picture.
They described a man of medium lithe stature, slender, about 140 pounds, maybe 5'10".
Yeah.
But the real curveball is his complexion and his hair. Grenard explicitly noted that he had sandy hair and was of very light complexion.
Yeah.
He didn't have the broad, high cheekbones common to his peers. He had a sharp, straight, narrow nose.
And horn chips back this up entirely, noting that Crazy Horse's hair was remarkably light, reaching down below his hips. White Bull also pointed out his light complexion and his quiet, unassuming manner.
So now, look at the Garnier tintype. The man staring back at you have a narrow face. The cheekbones are not broad.
No, they aren't.
He has distinctly light-colored hair and a very slender build. In terms of overall bone structure and physical type, the man of the photo is a startlingly good match for those unusual eyewitness descriptions.
It really is.
But, and this is a massive but, there's one glaring physical detail that brings everything to a screeching halt.
The scar.
Ah, yes, the scar. In 1870, an incident occurred that violently altered Crazy Horse's face.
Yeah.
He had persuaded a woman named Black Buffalo Woman to elope with him. Her husband, No Water, tracked them down, walked right into the tipi, and fired a pistol point blank into Crazy Horse's face.
It's a miracle he survived it all.
Seriously.
Dog described the wound with clinical precision. He said the bullet entered just below the left nostril, shattered his upper jaw, and exited near the base of the skull at the back of his neck.
And a reporter for the New York Sun in 1877 actually saw Crazy Horse and noted that the bullet wounds severely disfigured his face, giving his mouth a drawn, fierce expression.
This is where the skeptics plant their flag, firmly. Because when you analyze the tintype, the undeniable severe disfigurement you would expect from a point-blank gunshot wound that literally shattered an upper jaw, it just isn't obvious. No, it's not. You can scrutinize the shadows on the left side of the subject's face all day long, but there is no definitive scar.
Now, proponents of the photo argue that a low-resolution 19th century tintype, combined with the fact that tintypes produce a laterally reversed mirror image, and the flat lighting of the studio, all of that could obscure the scar.
Sure, maybe.
Especially if the subject purposely positioned his face to minimize it, as self-conscious people often do. But I admit, it takes a lot of mental gymnastics to explain away a shattered jaw.
It does, and the missing scar is just the tip of the skeptical iceberg. We have to give the historical and environmental objections their full weight. The physical setting of the photograph is deeply problematic.
We're talking about the painted background, right?
Exactly. Photo historians look at the gradient lighting and the painted backdrop in this tintype, and they immediately recognize the hallmarks of an established urban skylight studio. Those existed in larger cities. They did not exist in the chaotic, temporary frontier environment of Camp Robinson in the summer of 1877. No other surviving photograph from any known photographer at the agency that summer features this specific painted backdrop.
And then there is his outfit. He's wearing an ascot tie and a long, elaborate hairpipe breastplate.
Yeah.
Critics point out that this specific combination of attire is much more associated with Native American performers in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show,
Which didn't even start touring until 1883.
years after Crazy Horse died. Plus, eyewitnesses noted he dressed incredibly modestly, often in a plain white buckskin suit without heavy ornamentation.
This brings us to a really tangled knot in the historical record. To understand the deepest skepticism, we have to separate two different mysteries that historians often accidentally mash together.
Okay, yes, let's untangle this because this is important. Mystery number one involves a photographer named James H. Hamilton. He actually visited the Red Cloud Agency in August of 1877. We know he kept a catalog of his images, and we know that catalog entry number 104 is labeled Crazy Horse.
But Hamilton's image number 104 has never been found. It is lost to history.
Completely lost.
The surviving tintype we are analyzing today, the one with the painted backdrop and the ascot, does not come from Hamilton's catalog. It comes from the family of a frontier scout named Baptiste Little Bat Garnier.
Which brings us to mystery number two. The Garnier family provenance story claims that Little Bat Garnier, who was a trusted scout, was the one who finally persuaded his friend Crazy Horse to sit for this secret photograph.
Yeah.
So people naturally assumed Garnier took Crazy Horse to Hamilton's studio at the agency.
But that theory collapses when you look at the diary of John Hunton.
Oh, this is the nail in the coffin for that theory.
It is. Hunton was Little Bat Garnier's brother-in-law, and his meticulous records prove exactly where Garnier was in August 1877 when Hamilton was at the agency. Garnier was miles away. He was
Okay, I'm going to take the third chair for a minute. For me, the studio is the hardest problem. Clothing can travel and memories can differ, but a professional studio environment has to exist somewhere. If we can't explain that setting, then the photograph still has a very serious authenticity problem. Look at this tintype. The subject is real, but the environment is a construction. The studio was a controlled stage, often at odds with the reality of the people it captured. It's the objection I would want solved first, before we call a piece authentic. That doesn't make it fake, but it means we have to look past the painted columns and the props to find the truth of the person standing there. At the third chair, we prioritize primary sources, the archaeological data, and the ordnance records over the traditional narratives we've been handed. So, solve the studio problem for me. Click the blue waving hand, hit the join button, and help us challenge the conclusions. I'll see you in the description.
Third chair, I'm turning to you. Which of those objections troubles you the most? Is it the missing star, the anachronistic clothing, or the professional studio setting? And would any single one of them be enough for you to reject the photograph entirely?
I mean, for me, the studio backdrop is the hardest pill to swallow.
Really?
Yeah, a painted canvas and gradient lighting imply a level of permanent commercial infrastructure. It sharply contradicts the reality of a tense military camp managing the surrender of thousands of people.
I totally get that. But I sometimes wonder if our modern understanding of 19th century indigenous fashion and logistics is just a bit too rigid.
How so?
Well, we see an ascot tie and scream 1880s Wild West show. But trade goods moved incredibly fast on the frontier. Is it completely impossible that a hairpipe breastplate and a tie made their way to a Nebraska agency in 1877?
Probably not impossible, no.
Right. But still, with all these massive red flags, you're probably wondering why on earth I changed my mind. Why do I lean toward authenticity?
Because of the counter-evidence, and that evidence forces us to confront how we value Lakota oral history and family tradition.
Yes.
Yeah.
The entire case for this photo rests on the Garnier family.
Yeah.
Littleback Garnier's daughter, Ellen Howard, was proudly half Oglala and fiercely connected to her heritage.
Yeah.
She signed a formal certificate of authenticity stating unequivocally that her father always told her the tintype was of Crazy Horse.
And the oral tradition states that Littleback promised the chief he would keep the photograph a secret.
Which explains so much.
It explains why it didn't surface immediately, why it wasn't sold in catalogs, and why it wasn't commercialized during their lifetimes. Garnier honored the trust that was required to get the man in the chair in the first place.
And this brings up a profound issue about historical bias. A contributor to a historical forum, going by the name Oglala History, made an incredibly sharp observation.
What did they say?
They pointed out the systemic prejudice in how Western historians evaluate evidence. We tend to unquestioningly believe white military paper records. If a cavalry officer scribbles something in a ledger, it's treated as gospel.
Right.
But when native oral traditions and family accounts are presented, they are almost immediately dismissed as folklore, or myth, or a game of telephone.
Which completely misunderstands how indigenous oral histories function. They were not casual gossip. In cultures without a written alphabet, oral history was a rigorous communal method of preserving truth.
What caused my personal shift? We have a physical match that aligns perfectly with the very unusual eyewitness descriptions. The light hair, the slender build, the narrow nose.
They're all there.
Combine that with a firm, unbroken line of family provenance from an Oglala family who took their history seriously. When you give that oral history its due weight, the scales start to tip.
It's an uncomfortable tension for a historian, though.
It is. So third chair, here is your final prompt. If this tintype were of a completely unidentified person, rather than the legendary mythic Crazy Horse, would you consider the family provenance and the Lakota identifications to be strong historical evidence? Are we applying an impossibly high standard simply because of who we want him to be?
It's a fantastic question, because if this was just labeled Portrait of an Oglala Warrior, we'd likely accept the Garnier family provenance without a second thought.
Absolutely we would.
But because it's Crazy Horse, the scrutiny is astronomical.
And applying a double standard to native oral history versus European written history is a bias we have to actively dismantle if we want a complete picture of the American West. So where does this leave us on the final verdict of the Garnier tintype?
It leaves us in a gray area. The skepticism regarding the studio backdrop, the clothing, the missing scar, and the John Hunnan diary breaking the timeline, it is all incredibly valid.
Yeah.
You cannot just wave away the historical conflict.
You can't. But here is where I land. The family provenance is direct. The physical match to the eyewitness descriptions is too striking to ignore.
Yeah.
The rigorous nature of the Garnier family's oral tradition makes a deeply compelling case for authenticity. Believing the photo is real requires believing that an exception was made, a secret was kept, and the circumstances of the photo session were an anomaly outside the standard military records.
Right.
But history is full of anomalies. We may have lost the indisputable proof to the chaotic winds of 1877, but I lean toward it being authentic.
You're choosing to trust the family's memory over the gaps in the paper trail.
I am. Now, what stands out to you, the third chair? We want to hear your verdict. Subscribe to the show, drop it in the comments, and tell us, is this the face of Crazy Horse?
And as you ponder your verdict, I want to leave you with one final, broader question to chew on.
Good.
We have spent this entire deep dive analyzing a tintype, debating collodion chemicals, painted backdrops, and scars. We are driven by this desperate modern need to see his face, to categorize him, to put him in a historical box.
Right.
But Crazy Horse was a man who actively and intentionally avoided the camera to protect his spiritual power. By obsessing over finding and verifying his photograph, are we doing a profound disservice to his memory?
Wow.
In our desire to visually document him, are we fundamentally ignoring the very beliefs and the spiritual modesty that made him the great leader he was?
It makes you wonder, if that tintype really is his shadow caught on an iron plate, would he ever forgive us for staring at it? Thanks for pulling up a chair and joining this deep dive. Keep questioning the history you think you know.